Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On this episode, a researcher finds she was killing animals for useless science and how the body count of rats and mice finally got to her.
The more the number of animals started to build up and I was killing more and more animals, and the more I realized, these projects are just to get me my degree. They're not actually contributing anything to science. And, realizing when I sit down to write my papers, having to justify my use of animals was like, well, why am I even using animals in the first place? So as those bodies started to build up, I just really came to the realization that there's something wrong here and what I'm doing is not right.
Dr. Emily Trunnell was a young PhD candidate who went through a process she could no longer justify, especially the use of a guillotine, which put animals to death.
I would go in every day and weigh them and feed them and weigh their food. At the end of whatever time frame I designed in my experiments, I would put them in a chamber, fill it with something to make them go to sleep, either carbon dioxide or another anesthetic, and then I would use a guillotine and cut their heads off and dissect their brains and other parts of their bodies.
A researcher's personal story, how one neuroscientist had to stop harming and killing for science and change her life for the animals. But first, thanks again for joining us for this episode of the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with your friends and let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. Go to our webpage at PETA.org and listen to all the episodes, including the first episode with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk, who debunks many of the myths you've heard about PETA and animal rights. If you want more about why no-kill shelters are ineffective, for example, you can check out episode 18 and hear about how PETA's shelter doesn't turn anyone away and is often called the shelter of last resort. And if you're thinking that SeaWorld is okay to visit, listen to episode 6 and PETA VP Lisa Lange. Or listen to all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you download podcasts. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the donate button at PETA.org. And if you happen to have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Dr. Emily Trunnell grew up in the South as a young girl in love with knowledge. She became a neuroscientist, but soon found herself unable to continue in a career where she was asked to routinely kill animals in the name of science. Trunnell sought out the truth on her own and discovered that animal studies based on experimentation were irrelevant when it comes to humans. But that awareness alienated her PhD mentor, who felt betrayed and wouldn't walk with her at graduation. The newly minted Dr. Trunnell didn't attend her commencement exercises. Ultimately, she found herself a new path as a researcher for PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, which is dedicated to the goal of ending animal experimentation. But not before she saw firsthand the cruelty of modern vivisection in America's research labs. My conversation with Dr. Emily Trunnell on this episode of the PETA Podcast. What exactly is a neuroscientist? Let's start at the basics. What does a trained neuroscientist do?
Well, a neuroscientist is just someone who understands the brain and has studied the brain. Some neuroscientists do things like imaging the brain. Some focus more on the molecular level. I'm in the latter category, but really just someone who understands how the brain works and probably has a specific specialty within that.
And so when you studied to be a neuroscientist, and God, I guess it was your dream, right? At one point as a small girl, you thought, I'm going to be a neuroscientist one day, right? And then there you were. a neuroscientist.
I went into neuroscience and science in general just because I like to learn things. I like to know a lot about things, and, the brain's a pretty cool thing to know about.
And then you found yourself at the highest levels, right? PhD, you're in, and then you begin working where? Where does a newly minted neuroscientist go to work?
So, a lot of neuroscientists continue in academia, so they get their PhD and then they do a postdoctoral fellowship, which is sort of extended training, and then go on to be professors. Some neuroscientists work in commercial labs, in drug development. Some neuroscientists go on to work in nonprofits or more in the government policy side of things. So it's a pretty broad spectrum, and kind of just depends on your specialty and how you want to use your knowledge. I thought I wanted to be a physician, so I thought I was going to go to medical school, and sort of decided against that, and decided to go to graduate school instead. So after my undergraduate was completed, I took a couple years off just to work, and then went back to grad school for neuroscience.
And so once you got your PhD, which is not an easy thing, then describe your career path after that.
So after finishing my PhD, I knew I didn't want to continue doing the types of things that I had been doing. I'd been experimenting on animals, and I knew that I didn't want to continue to do that. I didn't want to kill animals for the rest of my life. So I looked for other ways that I could use my skills and knowledge, and I just happened to come across a position at PETA. They were looking for someone to work on the anti-animal experimentation side of their campaigns, and so I took that leap and joined the other side.
Well, let's talk about that a bit. I mean, when you started realizing that your job as a researcher was to kill animals, that happened pre-PhD, right? As you were studying for your PhD, that had to hit you. Just describe that moment that you certainly must recall, huh?
Sure. So it was a gradual process for me, coming to terms with what I was doing, and whether or not it was beneficial in any way. I remember I met with my major professor during my first year of grad school, and we sort of talked about what kind of projects I would be doing. And it was just kind of understood that I would be doing experiments on animals, something that I didn't know going into.
So you didn't know it was going to include animals, or you didn't think about it prior?
I didn't really, no, I didn't, I knew that I was going to do experiments. And I guess if I go back and look and think about it, I probably understood that happened. What I didn't know was how ubiquitous it was, that pretty much most of the people in my degree program were doing experiments on animals. And so I learned that, when I got into graduate school, and afterwards. And it was kind of presented to me as that's what journals want to publish. They don't care if you do experiments on cells. They want to see experiments done on a live organism. So therefore, I'd have to be doing experiments on animals.
What kind of animals were you experimenting on, or your colleagues were experimenting on that sort of changed your mind about the whole thing?
Well, I used rats in my research mostly, some mice. And the more, at first I thought, okay, it'll be a few animals here and there. But the more the number of animals started to build up, and I was killing more and more animals, and the more I realized, these projects are just to get me my degree. They're not actually contributing anything to science. And, realizing when I sit down to write my papers, having to justify my use of animals was like, well, why am I even using animals in the first place? So as those bodies started to build up, I just really came to the realization that there's something wrong here, and what I'm doing is not right.
Did you have a sort of a body count that sort of just got to you that made you feel more uncomfortable, or how did describe that? What was happening with every paper or every um, you know different experiment? How did the body count affect you?
Uh, it just seeing, continuing to plan projects and trying to estimate the number of animals that I would need to use and getting through those projects and having to kill the animals and dissect them and number all of the tubes and things that I was putting all of their body parts in. It just, it, when those numbers started adding up and when I later reached a different ethical conclusion that, not even one rat's life would be worth what I was doing. But at the time, I thought more, look at the number of animals' lives that have gone to pretty much just getting me my degree. And I just didn't think that that was worth it.
And how about your friends? Did your friends think you were a little strange for even questioning, or what kind of support did you get, or what kind of reaction did you get from your friends or colleagues?
They definitely thought I was a little weird. It's pretty taboo uh, to even talk about the ethics of using animals. I mean, people do at times, people who do experiment on animals. It comes up every now and then, but it's dismissed sort of as, well, what we're doing is for the good of humanity. And it wasn't really until I sat down, even after I finished my dissertation, and sat down and started to look at the data and the evidence of have experiments on animals contributed to human health or animal health, and the answer was clearly no. Um, but yeah, it was a different reality for them in their thinking, and I was already kind of a weirdo because I didn't think it was ethical to eat animals, so I was already kind of in that weirdo category within my group.
I mean, but when your friends saw that, did they did they try to talk you out of it? Did they try to say, "Hey, look, this is our job. This is science. This is what we do, and there's a higher purpose here in this research." Did anyone try to give you that line, or?
So yeah, that I mean that's what they've been indoctrinated to believe. Um, there's there's no talk that when you're sitting down and discussing at lunch or even during a conference, there's not really a discussion between scientists who are doing experiments on animals whether or not these animals are really the best so-called models to use for the questions that they want to ask. It's just you're indoctrinated to think, well, yes, they are, and anyone who questions that is, slapping science in the face or something similar to that. So
Did you see it as maybe a blind spot on their part? And did you question them? Did you try to engage in that conversation so that they had to answer the tough question?
well, by the time I came to the realization myself that the use of animals in science was not the great thing that it had been portrayed as. This was after I'd finished my degree, and so I had moved to a different town, and I wasn't face to face with these people anymore. I did get a little bit of backlash. My major professor said he did not want to welcome me at graduation, so I didn't attend my graduation.
Did that hurt when he said that?
It was hurtful. I was disappointed. I understood where he was coming from. He's very pro animal experimentation, and joining PETA was probably the last thing that he wanted his mentee to do. But I was sad that I could have walked and had someone else give me get this whole robe and hood and sort of look like some medieval person when you finish your doctorate. But it would have been nice to do that whole thing. But I felt like my relationship with my graduate program was kind of soured at that point, and really I've had pretty much no contact with most anybody that I was in school with or in my graduate program.
To hear you say that, I mean, it really is like a clean cut, like a divorce from a past life into something else. Did you know what that something else would be? Or did you know what all your training might where it might lead?
I really had no idea what would happen. I saw this position at PETA to work to end animal experimentation. And even at the time when I was considering taking the position, I didn't know myself yet. I knew that what I had experienced was wrong. That the experiments that I had done, the lives that I took, like that should never have been approved. But I didn't know. I hadn't really considered whether or not all animal experimentation should be ended. So I did my research and I learned about, the 95% drug failure rate, drugs that go test safe and effective in animals. They go to human clinical trials, and 95% of them are not safe or they're not effective in humans. And then I sort of so I learned about that. And so that really put it in a different perspective to me, and one that I hadn't heard before. And then I sort of came to the ethical conclusion as well that, it's not really their burden to bear our experiments and try to solve our diseases, even though their experiments using animals weren't doing that. But even if it did, I just didn't feel it was their burden to bear, and their lives should be taken for that.
What did your advisors say when you made that discovery? Because certainly you had to speak to your mentor and
Well, I had already graduated and defended my dissertation at this point, so we weren't terribly close to begin with, and we didn't really talk much after that. And he didn't try to talk me out of it. He just kind of said that he felt, and I don't want to misquote him, but a word like betrayed. He felt betrayed, and that I made that decision. But there was really no discussion after that.
when you went into the field, though, you said you went into it eyes open, and you didn't really understand that there would be experimentation, though, right?
That could be my own, just kind of jumping in and wanting to learn things, and then okay, however I have to learn it, let's do this, and not really understanding, how ubiquitous the use of animals was. And I think the public, I think the everyday person doesn't really understand how many animals are used in senseless experiments every day. I remember talking to some of my friends who weren't in graduate school with me, and when I would say, "Oh well, this is what I'm studying," and they ask how I do that, and I say, "Well, I use rats," and they kind of have the shocked look on their face. So I think a lot of people don't really understand how ubiquitous it is.
Tell me about those experiments. I mean, they're so ubiquitous. You did them, and you did them early on when you weren't quite as informed. But tell me about the experiments. What were they like?
Well, the types of experiments that I did in graduate school. So I mentioned that my undergraduate background was in nutrition, and I was interested in continuing sort of nutrition research in graduate school, and sort of how nutrition and diet affected the brain, bringing those two together. So I would feed animals different diets, usually a high-fat diet, feed them to rats. And, I'd have to go in every day. The rats would arrive, and I have to go in every day and get them used to me handling them. And then I would go in every day and weigh them and feed them and weigh their food. And then at the end, at the end of whatever time frame I designed in my experiments, I would put them in a chamber, fill it with something to make them go to sleep, either carbon dioxide or another anesthetic, and then I would use a guillotine and cut their heads off and dissect their brains and other parts of their bodies.
Did you ever get to know them in the process, or in the process of making them familiar with you?
I definitely bonded with the animals. I didn't do very long-term experiments, and I think that's one thing that helped ease my mind at the time, I guess, in killing them, because I didn't know them for very long. But when I did get to know them, it was clear that they each had their own personalities. Certain ones were more curious, certain rats were shyer. There were some that when you'd hold them, some would just put their heads in the crook of your arm, because they like when it's dark, and then some would try to climb on your shoulders and explore and sniff you, and so they're all individuals, and that was very clear in getting to know them.
Did you ever name any of them?
No, they are taught not to do that, of course, because
They
that
teach
would
you that. They
they
teach
teach
you
you
that.
that. Yeah, they have numbers or numbers and letters, and not names. You're not supposed to get attached to them because God forbid you have any empathy.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that term, which kind of surprised me, and I didn't want to jump on it when you mentioned it. But this idea of a guillotine, you used a guillotine?
Yeah, so they make little guillotines that are rat and mouse sized, and that's a quick way to kill them. So that's what we used.
When you did it the first time, was it hard, or did it just get easier, or was it always hard?
It was always hard. In my first few experiments, actually, someone else did that part of it. And so I was exposed to it, but didn't have to pull the lever myself. Later, I did pull the lever myself, and every time it was really difficult. At the end of an experiment, when you have days that you're killing the animals, it's an all day process of killing one after the other. And I would come home at the end of those days, and I just felt like I could barely function. I pretty much had to shut my brain down to do that, and those were not happy days.
How many would you kill in a day, would you say?
Um, we kill probably between 6 and 10 animals in a day.
And how many would you say you needed for an entire PhD career if you were to do this? How many would you have to use? And when you did an accounting, how many animals were used?
So it depends on how many animals you use, really depends on the project. I did try to do an accounting, and I was having these reservations when I was writing my dissertation, even though I hadn't completely realized how awful animal experimentation was as a whole. And so I did an accounting because I dedicated my dissertation to the animals that I used, and through me killing them directly and through other experiments that were done on animals, and so that I could process their tissues, their body parts for data, it was right around 200 mice and rats.
Mm. And that's just you.
That's just me. And again, that was just to get me a PhD. Not hardly any of those. There's one or two of those experiments were even published, and as we know now, they still don't mean anything for human health because, well, it's rats.
And once again, for people who don't understand, I mean, yeah, it's easy to say, "Oh, yeah, those are rats and mice, and humans are human." Um, I don't think people get the fact that they're two different species, two different entities, that they have little relevance. The findings in one mean little to human health. I mean, I think if more people realize that, then they'd see how fruitless these experiments really are.
You're completely right.
Well, why is it that we can't make that jump? Why is it that most people will deny that basic fact that there's an irrelevance between what you find in rats.
I think that people generally trust scientists, and many animal experimentation has been going on for a very long time, and you had interviewed my colleague Jeremy on another podcast, and he correctly pointed out, we're not trying to figure out anymore whether or not another mammal has a heart with 4 chambers. We're looking at the microcosm, at genetics and the way genes are regulated. And here, that's really where the differences occur. And those differences are huge when it comes to health and medicine and disease. So, but I think, scientists have been experimenting on animals for a long time. A lot of them do it because it's what they know how to do, and they're getting money from NIH to do it. They've built careers around it. And so they're not going to give it up easily, and they tell the public that what they're doing is beneficial, and a lot of them believe it themselves. Most of them do. So I think there's a problem there with scientists not stepping forward to say, look, what we're doing is wrong.
When you made that realization, when you understood at various points in your academic career, did you want to just share it with your colleagues and say, hey, don't you see, did you want to go to the mountaintops and let everyone know? How did you feel? How did you communicate what you felt? And what was the reaction?
Definitely. I mean, when I learned about all the failures of animal experimentation, I wanted to share these things with my colleagues. I would, post about them on social media, where I still have friends and followers that I knew during my time doing animal experimentation. And there's really overall a lack of discussion. I think many people, and I don't want to single out the people that I know because this is just a general problem. If we admit that, then what are we doing? What have we built industries around? What have we spent all our time and years and, heartache and sweat and tears? Why have we been doing it? So I think there's a desire not to look and not to face that reality.
So there essentially is the belief that, well, we got this far, we have to perpetuate the fraud. We have to keep the lie alive, right?
Right. I mean, it's kind of silly, but sometimes I think there is people use the excuse in their head, oh, well, if we don't continue doing this, then all of those animal lives will have been for nothing. But they are for nothing, and continuing to use more and more animals just to justify their past use, I mean, that really doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't seem to make any scientific sense, which is sort of the odd thing when you consider that we're in a scientific enterprise here. But what if we lived in the perfect world where we confronted this fact that, well, you can experiment all you want on rats and mice and monkeys, but the relevance to humans is practically nil. What if we had that realization? Then what would happen?
If we realized that all the experiments on animals weren't providing the medical benefits that many claim that they are, I mean, first of all, we could really move forward with non-animal methods, which are lacking in funding. I mean, and 40% of the National Institute of Health budget goes towards animal experiments. That's taxpayer money that could be going towards human relevant methods that use human cells that are based on human genetics and physiology, and that will get us a lot closer to curing those diseases like cancer, which we've cured in mice 1 million times, yet no cures for humans yet. So if once we have that realization, we'll get a lot closer to where we want to be in helping people who are suffering.
So in a lot of ways, I mean, all right, I'm guilty of sports analogies, but I mean, this is sort of like if you continue to uh, experiment on rats and mice and monkeys and animals that have no relevance to humans. I mean, it's almost like a scientist continuing to play in the minor leagues, because there are no answers there. They've got to step up and move into these other areas where there might be some real answers, but no one wants to fund that, right? I guess people feel that, well, at least with these rat and mice experiments, we have some kind of it appears like there's a success. Like you said, we've cured cancer in rats and mice, and that's success.
Yeah, that's success to them. That gets them a publication and in a journal, which is the measure of progress in your academic career. And doesn't has less to do with actually finding cures and learning than it does getting publications. And that's really sad. And I feel like a lot of scientists, the reason that they're not moving on to non-animal methods is just fear of change. I mean, it's hard to learn new things. Everyone knows that. And they've built their laboratories, they have all the equipment to use on mice and rats or whatever animal that they're using. And so that's a huge investment that they've made to continue doing that.
Toward being wrong, really, essentially, which doesn't make sense.
Right.
You know, this happened to you, and I'm sure we're all unique, but there must be other doctoral students who are similar to you or have the same sensibilities, but they just haven't gotten to that moment or gotten to that part in their careers like you did. What would you say to those doctoral students who maybe some of whom are capable of the kind of empathy that you showed, but may still be cowed by big science and big research and mentors and other colleagues? What would you say to them? How do they get to the answer that you got to?
I would say it is scary. You look up to your mentors and the people who are telling you, yes, this is the way we should do things. We should experiment on animals. But if you have that realization, if you feel empathy for these animals and you start to wonder, why am I doing this? Why can't I do my research another way? You 100% can. And I would say just stand up for that, look into, really learn about non-animal methods and, talk about these with your boss. If your boss is steadfast that using animals is the best way, consider a change in mentors. It's not, that's something that you can do, and just come at it with knowledge, because when you really look at these non-animal methods and you learn about them, it becomes so clear that they're superior to using animals. This science has shown this time and time again. And science is about evolving your thinking and have faith that other people can do that, and just be open to discuss it with them.
Of course, easier said than done, right?
Of course.
If you're in the establishment and they're into we're going to kill 200 rats in your PhD career, well then that's what you're going to do. I mean, it takes a certain kind to stand up, right? And maybe those are the scientists who are worth their salt because they will challenge, but most aren't, right?
I think most are in some way, if they can find that courage, and just know that ultimately, you're going to be right in the long run, and that's only going to be better for your career. So even if you started out on the wrong foot, you can always change. I mean, it's about the pursuit of knowledge and learning things. And, when you learn new things, you can change and do better. When you know better, you can do better. And until then, you really can't. So just learn about these things, learn about non-animal methods, and know that you'll be right in the long run.
Isn't it strange though that it takes courage to do that? It takes courage to be on the right side of right.
It shouldn't be strange, but it is. When you have a system as entrenched as animal experimentation is, I mean, whole industries are built around this. It's the primary type of research funded by our government bodies. And it shouldn't take courage to stand up for, I mean, it shouldn't be strange to stand up for what's right. And eventually the system will catch up, and it is.
Your job right now is to make sure that the system catches up a lot faster. Describe the kind, because we want to leave people on a hopeful note, because you left the dark side of science and you've walked toward the light, right?
Right. So I was in a pretty sad place when I finished my degree, just knowing what I had done to animals and knowing that it didn't amount to much. But I found this position at PETA, and I get to research non-animal methods and uh, work with universities and programs to try to get them implemented. I get to work on policy decisions. Our ethics surrounding use of animals in a lot of areas is changing, and our policies are changing with that. So I get to be on that side, on the right side of history now. And I'm still doing science. I'm still reading papers every day. I'm still thinking up and planning experiments to test theories. And I get to do all of that while helping animals and helping people, because this research that's not done with animals will ultimately go further towards helping the human race.
Is there something that gives you more hope in the things that you're doing now? What is the thing that is the most hopeful that you're finding in the field of experimentation, or in the field of non-animal experimentation, that might help reach your former colleagues, or help your former colleagues reach the goals that they've set for themselves?
One thing that's really inspiring to me, every day we get this email, sort of the stories of the day, and in every email every day, there's a news article that's come out about a non-animal method that's been tested and shown to be better than animals in predicting uh, whatever they're testing in humans. So every day these news articles are coming out showing how non-animal methods are superior, and it's more and more articles every day, and I think that's really encouraging. And these pharmaceutical companies, their bottom line you know depends on doing correct science and being in and conducting experiments in the correct way. And they're abandoning animal experiments left and right. They're using, these things called organs on a chip or other devices that use human cells, and they're finding that these are much more predictive of what happens in humans. So that's super encouraging, just to see that day after day.
Is it going to be a generational shift? Because I imagine as more young scientists who are, maybe more in the know with technology, or more in tune with the technological change, they might be able to force the establishment to move in these directions, especially if they show results. Do you see that happening, that this new generation of scientists coming to the fore?
It is hard. It seems harder for older scientists to switch their career path. Like I've said, that this is something that they've this is something that they've built their whole life around. And younger scientists are coming up while we have all of these superior non-animal methods, and they're much more aware of them. They're still early in their careers. They can choose whether or not they want to experiment on animals or use these better methods. And so I really do think we're going to see a generational shift towards the use of non-animal methods.
All right, name one thing that people should look for in the news, in the mainstream newspapers, and say within the next couple of years it's going to be a breakthrough in ending animal experimentation in a certain field. That's going to say, here's a non-animal method. it works, it gives results, and it gives us the change we want. And that could be the tipping point, as it were, that would make people say, oh, well, maybe we don't have to experiment on rats and mice and monkeys. Well, what's the one thing they should be looking for?
I would say the thing to look out for, follow the organ on a chip. It's a small microfluidic device. It just means it's about the size of a computer memory chip, and it has human cells. And scientists can use physics to create really precise microenvironments that are just like what's inside our own bodies. And so we're starting to be able to connect different chips. So we have ones for a gut on a chip, and a lung on a chip, and other organs, and we're starting to be able to connect these in a system to where we're eventually going to have a whole human on a chip. And the studies have already shown that these are much more predictive. For example, recently they used a blood vessel on a chip to test this antibody drug that had come out in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when this antibody drug came out, it was tested in animals and shown to be safe. When it went to human clinical trials, the humans developed blood clots, and the trials had to be stopped. And it's not until we had this human blood vessel on a chip and we tested the drug on that, and the same reaction happened in the chip. There were blood clots. It's called thrombosis occurred, and this wasn't predicted at all by animals. So this area, microfluidics or organs on chips and humans on chips, that's really an area to follow if you're interested. It's fascinating.
And then I guess when you realize things like that, then it must feel gratifying for you, because you left the old field and are helping to pioneer these new roads.
It's pretty amazing, and it's very inspiring. Every day a new study comes out that verifies what we know, that using human relevant methods is way better than using animals. And so it really feels amazing to know that I'm going to be on the right side of history there.
Dr. Emily Trunnell, a researcher with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, how she went from killing animals to saving animals in the effort to make research more modern, humane, and effective. To find out more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. Remember, it helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.